My landlady warned me there was something I should know, but I never expected it would change how I feel about her forever. The first time I stepped into the apartment, I felt like I'd entered a small world suspended between comfort and curiosity. The hallway smelled faintly of polished wood and lavender. Clean but intimate, the kind of scent that immediately settled nerves. Boxes in my arms shifted slightly as I hesitated at the threshold, half expecting someone to appear out of nowhere. And then she was there, my landlady. She appeared at the end of the hall, leaning lightly against the doorframe, one hand resting casually on her hip. She was 40, maybe 42, but carried herself with a confidence and grace that made her presence quietly commanding. She wasn't loud or flashy. She simply existed in a way that made the room feel warmer. Her hair caught the soft light, a subtle honey brown streaked with just a hint of silver, framing a face that was attractive in an understated, elegant way. "There's something you should know before you stay," she said, her voice calm but holding a note of seriousness that immediately made me pause. The sentence lingered in the air, like a melody unfinished. My curiosity spiked. I wanted to ask, to probe, but I also didn't want to overstep. There was something in the way she looked at me, direct, perceptive, yet not invasive, that made me aware of how little she actually needed to say. She walked toward me, her movements measured and graceful, the soft tap of her shoes on the hardwood floor echoing slightly. She handed me the keys, her fingers brushing mine ever so lightly. The touch was fleeting, almost accidental, but it left a tiny spark of awareness. I felt it in my chest, a subtle flutter I couldn't quite place, and I realized I was already noticing her in ways I hadn't anticipated. The apartment itself was modest but cozy. Light poured in through a large window in the living room, illuminating dust motes that danced lazily in the sunbeams. A faint scent of coffee lingered, and I imagined her mornings here, reading a book with the sunlight on her face, maybe humming a tune quietly to herself. The space reflected her personality. Neat but lived in, thoughtful details everywhere. A vase of fresh flowers on the table. Books stacked neatly but not rigidly. A few personal trinkets scattered in ways that suggested a life fully lived yet open to sharing. I tried to focus on unpacking, but my attention kept drifting to her. She watched me as I moved around, her gaze curious yet patient, as if studying not just what I did but who I was. There was a faint smile playing at her lips when I fumbled with a box, and it sent an unexpected warmth through me. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it made me feel noticed in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. As she turned to leave, I heard her say the line again, almost softer this time. "Just keep it in mind." It was cryptic, teasing, and filled with a quiet gravity. I wanted to ask her to clarify, to know what she meant, but something told me it was meant to simmer, to build slowly, like the first note of a song that lingers in your mind long after it's over. I realized then that this wasn't just a new apartment. This was the beginning of something unpredictable, subtle, and potentially life-changing. And I couldn't help but feel alive. The first few days in the apartment were a quiet rhythm of boxes, unpacking, and the hum of a city outside my window. Yet, amidst the mundane, I found myself noticing her more and more. My landlady, the woman who had first warned me there was something I should know. It wasn't in her words, but in the little things. She left a small cup of tea on the counter one morning, still warm, with a note. "For when the day feels long." The handwriting was elegant but understated, like her, thoughtful without being showy. I wondered if she had left it just for me, or if this was her way of making every tenant feel noticed. Either way, my chest tightened with something I couldn't yet name. When we spoke, it was casual, almost accidental, but charged with a gentle energy. I'd ask about the apartment, and she'd answer with patience, peppered with small jokes or teasing remarks that made me laugh more than I expected. There was a warmth in her smile, a soft light in her eyes, and I started to find myself lingering in her presence longer than necessary. One afternoon, she noticed I was struggling to fix a wobbly chair. Before I could protest, she was beside me, her hands deftly adjusting the screws. I caught the faint brush of her fingers against mine as she handed me the screwdriver, a fleeting touch that sent a small jolt through me. I looked up and met her gaze, and for a moment, the room felt smaller, warmer, somehow more intimate. She smiled softly, as if she'd noticed my reaction and found it quietly amusing. Even the way she moved around the apartment caught my attention. The casual grace in her gestures, the slight tilt of her head when she studied something, the rhythm of her steps that somehow made the space feel alive. She had a presence that was at once soothing and electrifying, and I found myself drawn to it, even while trying not to be. There were tiny, almost imperceptible moments that tugged at me. A laugh that lingered just a fraction too long when I cracked a joke. Her hand resting briefly on my shoulder while explaining something. The way she seemed to know exactly when to offer help without overstepping, or when to step back, letting me handle things on my own. At night, I'd sit by the window and replay the day in my mind, remembering the way sunlight had caught her hair, or the softness of her voice as she had spoken. I realized I was beginning to crave those moments, subtle as they were. Each interaction, each small gesture, was building a quiet tension between us. An unspoken curiosity that neither of us acknowledged but both felt. It was in these small, ordinary moments that the extraordinary started to bloom. I didn't know exactly where it was heading, but I knew one thing. She had become the pulse at the center of my new life, and I couldn't stop noticing her. A week into my stay, the apartment began to feel less like a temporary space and more like a small world where she existed naturally, comfortably. I noticed her in ways that were quieter now, subtler, but far more affecting. One evening, I found her in the living room, seated on the sofa with a photo album open across her lap. She hadn't noticed me yet. Her fingers lingered on a black and white photo, tracing the outline of someone smiling long ago. There was a softness to her expression, a fleeting vulnerability I hadn't seen before. It caught me off guard, seeing her not as the composed, confident landlady I'd first met, but as a woman with memories that weighed on her, cherished yet bittersweet. I cleared my throat softly, and she looked up, startled for just a moment before composing herself. "I didn't hear you come in," she said, her voice carrying a hint of hesitation that made me pause. I realized then that I had glimpsed a side of her that wasn't meant for everyone. And yet, here I was, somehow allowed in. Over the next few days, our conversations began to deepen. They weren't about the apartment anymore or small daily tasks. They were about life, about choices, regrets, dreams, and fears. She spoke about her past with a quiet honesty, the kind that didn't demand sympathy but invited understanding. I found myself sharing pieces of my own story too. My hopes, my uncertainty about the future, and the subtle loneliness of being far from home. One rainy afternoon, we were sitting on the balcony, sipping tea and listening to the drizzle tap against the glass. I noticed the way her eyes softened when she laughed at something I said, how her hand instinctively rested on the railing near mine, so close that our fingers almost touched. It was a subtle intimacy, charged without words, yet entirely natural. She confided in me about moments of doubt, the choices she had made in life, and the sacrifices that came with them. I listened, careful not to interrupt, feeling a strange mix of admiration and protectiveness. I realized that the age gap between us wasn't a barrier. It was part of the depth of the connection forming. Her experiences fascinated me, but what struck me more was her openness, her willingness to share parts of herself so tenderly. Even in small gestures, her vulnerability was evident. The slight hesitation before answering a question about her past, the way she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear while she spoke, the warmth in her gaze when our eyes met. These little details rooted me in the moment. By the time I went to bed that night, I felt something new stirring. I wasn't just intrigued by her anymore. I cared, deeply, and I knew, without fully understanding how or why, that our connection was growing stronger, quietly, steadily, like the slow unfolding of a song whose melody lingers long after the notes fade. The first truly close moment between us wasn't dramatic. There were no confessions, no fireworks, just a quiet, ordinary afternoon that somehow became extraordinary. A sudden spring rainstorm had caught me off guard while running errands. By the time I returned to the apartment, my shirt was damp, hair sticking slightly to my forehead. She was in the living room, seated near the window, a mug of tea in her hands. She looked up as I entered, her expression flickering between concern and amusement. "Caught in the rain?" she asked, her voice calm, measured, but with a hint of playfulness that made me smile despite the wetness. Before I could answer, she stood and moved to the kitchen, returning with a soft towel and an extra blanket. "Here," she said, draping the towel over my shoulders. Her hands lingered for a moment, brushing the damp fabric against my neck. The contact was fleeting but enough to make my pulse quicken. "Sit," she instructed softly, gesturing toward the sofa. We ended up side by side, wrapped in the warmth of the blanket, the rain creating a gentle rhythm against the glass behind us. Our legs brushed together accidentally as I shifted, a subtle spark that neither of us acknowledged but both clearly felt. The room felt smaller, warmer, intimate without a word being spoken. We talked, as we often did, about trivial things at first. The storm, the clumsy way I had run through the streets, a shared memory from my childhood. But the conversation soon drifted into something deeper. She spoke of moments she regretted, of choices she had made that were difficult but necessary. I listened, genuinely engaged, offering small insights into my own uncertainties, my own fears about growing up too fast in a world that often felt too heavy. At one point, her hand brushed mine as she reached for her mug. I didn't move away, neither did she. Our fingers touched, just for a moment, but long enough to make me hyper-aware of her proximity. I could feel the warmth of her skin through the blanket, the subtle scent of her perfume, something soft, floral, lingering in the air. And I realized I hadn't noticed how intensely I had been drawn to her until that instant. Her gaze met mine, steady but gentle, and there was a pause, a silent acknowledgement of something neither of us had dared to name aloud. It was a delicate balance of comfort and tension, trust and curiosity, familiarity and the thrill of the unknown. The rain slowed, and we sat in quiet companionship, side by side, letting the moment stretch without forcing it into words. There was an unspoken understanding that this closeness, this gentle intimacy, was new, fragile, and significant. By the time the storm passed, I felt a subtle shift in the air between us. Something had moved, something unspoken, tender, and fragile, but it was enough to make the apartment feel different, more alive. That afternoon, in the quiet of a rainy room, I realized that we were no longer just landlady and tenant. We were two people navigating a delicate, growing connection, each moment of proximity hinting at possibilities neither of us could fully name yet. The closeness we had begun to share brought a warmth I hadn't expected, but with it came an equally unfamiliar tension. That warmth now came laced with hesitation, and suddenly, the apartment that had felt like a small haven started to feel like a delicate stage where every gesture, every glance, carried weight. It started subtly, a lingering look that lasted just a moment too long, a brush of her fingers on a doorknob that seemed to echo against my skin, a small pause in conversation that stretched far beyond what was necessary. I began to notice the hesitation in her movements, the slight tightening of her shoulders when I joked about staying longer than my lease allowed, the careful way she avoided letting her hand touch mine too deliberately. One evening, she caught me staring while she rearranged some books on the shelf. I looked away immediately, pretending to be absorbed in something trivial on my phone, but I couldn't shake the awareness of her presence, the subtle shift of air between us. "You've been quiet today," she said, her tone gentle but probing, as if she could read my thoughts before I even formed them. "I'm fine," I said quickly, but my voice carried a hesitancy I couldn't hide. She studied me for a moment, eyes soft yet unreadable, and I felt the weight of unspoken questions between us. The tension grew when I accidentally saw her with a visitor, a friend, perhaps, or a relative. She laughed easily, touched his arm lightly, and I felt a pang of something I didn't fully understand. Jealousy, maybe, but more likely fear. Fear of misreading our connection, of stepping over boundaries we hadn't yet defined. I realized then that the emotional closeness I felt toward her was mirrored by uncertainty, hesitation, and the silent question, "Is this allowed?" Our interactions became a careful dance. When she handed me a mug of tea, her fingers lingered just a fraction too long. When I leaned over to read a note she had left, our shoulders brushed in a subtle, almost accidental touch. Each small gesture was laden with meaning, yet neither of us addressed it, and the tension built quietly, beautifully, painfully. One night, as I prepared to leave for a friend's gathering, I found myself lingering in the doorway. She gave me that half-smile she often reserved for private moments. "Be careful," she said softly, but her eyes stayed on mine a beat too long. I hesitated, wanting to reach out, to touch her hand, to tell her I didn't want to leave. But the words caught in my throat, and I stepped away, leaving both of us in a charged silence. That night, I realized that the age difference, the unspoken social rules, and the fear of crossing a line weren't just obstacles. They were a test of patience, trust, and desire. And in the quiet of my room, I understood that hesitation wasn't weakness. It was part of the slow, careful way our connection was growing. It wasn't yet safe to leap, but the pull between us had become undeniable. Every brush of skin, every accidental glance, every pause in conversation became a reminder. We were on the edge of something significant, something worth waiting for, something that, if mishandled, could vanish as quickly as it had appeared. It happened on a quiet evening, the kind where the city outside the apartment seemed to hold its breath, leaving only the soft hum of streetlights and distant cars. The rain from earlier had left the air clean and slightly chilled, and I found myself lingering by the window, my thoughts tangled with the subtle tension that had been growing between us for days. She appeared behind me without a sound, standing in the doorway with a faint smile that immediately made my chest tighten. "You're quiet tonight," she said, her voice gentle, warm, but with a softness that suggested she was measuring her words carefully. I've been thinking," I said, unsure how to put the jumble of emotions into words. My gaze remained fixed on the city lights, the reflection of her silhouette in the glass beside mine. "About us. About this." Her expression shifted, subtle but undeniable, a mix of curiosity and vulnerability. She stepped closer, and suddenly the air between us felt charged, almost alive. I felt the warmth of her presence, the faint scent of her perfume mingling with the crisp evening air. "I've been feeling it too," she admitted quietly, her hands loosely clasped in front of her. "The connection, the closeness. I didn't expect it either." Her eyes met mine, steady and sincere. There was no hesitation now, only honesty, and the weight of her words settled into the room like sunlight spilling through the window. We moved to the sofa, sitting side by side. The distance between us was small, intimate, but neither of us rushed to close it further. Our conversation deepened, peeling back layers we hadn't dared touch before. She shared the something she had warned me about, the reason she had been cautious from the start. A past heartbreak, a complicated situation, the shadows of experiences that had made her careful with trust. I listened, feeling the raw honesty in her voice, realizing that this was a gift, her vulnerability, shared with me. I reached out, my hand brushing lightly against hers. She didn't pull away. Our fingers touched, rested, and for the first time, there was no tension, no hesitation, just a quiet acknowledgement of what had been simmering between us for days. My voice was soft as I spoke, almost a whisper. "I don't care about the past. I only care about right now, and how I feel when I'm with you." Her lips curved into a small, genuine smile, one that reached her eyes and lit them from within. "I think I've been waiting for someone to say that," she admitted. She leaned slightly closer, not in urgency, but in a gesture that said she was willing to trust me with the space between us. For a long while, we sat in quiet companionship, letting the words hang in the air and the warmth of proximity settle in. It was a confession, but not a dramatic one. Just two people acknowledging a mutual desire and trust, the first real step in navigating something fragile and beautiful. By the end of the evening, I realized that everything that had come before, the hesitation, the accidental touches, the small gestures, had led to this moment. A moment where honesty bridged the gap between curiosity and connection. where the slow burn of days had finally become a steady, palpable flame. And for the first time, I felt certain of one thing. Whatever came next, we were moving forward together, carefully, deliberately, and completely aware of what this meant. The days that followed our confession were quiet, but charged with a new energy. The apartment felt different now, warmer, yet still intimate. Ordinary moments now carried an undercurrent of something extraordinary. Even the sunlight spilling through the window seemed brighter, catching her hair in a way that made my heart skip, while the faint scent of her perfume lingered like a gentle reminder that we were no longer just landlady and tenant. We moved with a new rhythm, careful but natural. There was no rush to define what came next, no urgency to leap into anything we weren't ready for. Instead, we found a comfort in proximity. Sharing tea in the mornings, sitting side by side on the sofa with our legs brushing lightly, talking softly about everything and nothing. Each gesture, each smile, carried a silent acknowledgement of what had begun between us. One afternoon, she reached out to adjust a stray lock of hair brushing my forehead. Her fingers lingered for a heartbeat, and I didn't pull away. It was a simple touch, yet it felt monumental, a testament to the trust and understanding that had grown in the quiet spaces of our days together. I caught her gaze and saw that same reflection in her eyes, the same mix of warmth, curiosity, and tentative hope. We laughed more easily now, our conversations flowing with a softness that had been missing before. There were no dramatic declarations, only the subtle poetry of shared glances, the brushing of hands as we passed objects, the quiet joy in being in each other's company. Even small conflicts or misunderstandings that arose were met with patience and empathy. We were learning the delicate dance of respecting boundaries while exploring closeness. One evening, as the sun dipped low, painting the room in gold and amber, she sat beside me on the balcony. We watched the city slowly come alive with lights, the air carrying the faint scent of evening rain. I hesitated for a moment, then reached for her hand. This time, there was no accidental touch, no tentative pause. Our fingers intertwined naturally, the warmth of her hand grounding me in the moment. "I don't know exactly what the future holds," I said softly, keeping my voice low, intimate. "But I want to find out with you." She squeezed my hand gently, a smile touching her lips. "I feel the same," she replied. Slowly, carefully, but fully. It wasn't a dramatic confession, nor did it need to be. The connection we had built over weeks of quiet moments, subtle touches, and shared vulnerabilities had reached a point of clarity. We didn't need grand gestures or proclamations. The intimacy of trust, respect, and mutual care was enough. As night fell, we stayed on the balcony, side by side, hands entwined, watching the city shimmer below. The tension that had once been tentative hesitation was now replaced by a quiet certainty. Whatever challenges lay ahead, we had each other, and the slow-burning connection that had brought us together was strong enough to guide the way. In that moment, I realized something profound. Some relationships don't need to shout to be powerful. They grow quietly, deeply, and irrevocably. And as I felt her hand warm in mine, I knew that this was only the beginning, our beginning. A new chapter written with trust, care, and the promise of something lasting. If you enjoyed this slow-burn story of curiosity, trust, and unexpected connection, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more heartwarming age gap romances. Share your thoughts. What would you do if you found yourself in a story like this? And hit the bell icon so you never miss the next chapter of love, tension, and life-changing moments.